Hello, this is Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time postmodern iconoclast, and welcome back to the Darling YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss mysticism, religion, the occult, and everything on the fringes of esoterica. And in this video, we're going to be talking about a paradigm of paganism that is almost never discussed, and that would be pre-Islamic era paganism, or pre-Islamic era polytheism, or wathanism, depending on what you want to call it. And that is the religion that existed in the Arabian region prior to the Islamic conversion. So, let's break into it. So, to talk about this religion, I think the first thing we need to discuss is a little bit about Islam and how Islam relates to this. So, as a European pagan, and as someone who focuses on that part of the world, we talk a lot about the European conversion and how when Europe was converted to Christianity, the region changed. But a lot of the pagan traditions were immortalized in Christianity, right? As Christians overtook the world, they did keep some pagan customs. And so when you look at how Christianity varies nation to nation, you'll notice that through lines of those old traditions peer through. This is true in Islam. And so to understand pre-Islamic era polytheism, we do need to take a little bit of a look at Islam and a look at that conversion and a look at Muhammad's background himself to understand what is going on. Because sadly, pre-Islamic era paganism does not have a lot of records about it. The big source that people use is what is known as the Book of the Idols, which was written by an Arab scholar. So of course, we're talking about history written by the victors. Just like when we look at European pagan manuscripts, and they are often written by Christians, we understand that as Christians, they have a bias going into this. And their bias is to make paganism not look bad. Typically, the people recording it are historians as well. They are not religious individuals. They are not invested in it in the same way that we are. So that is going to translate into what I'm pulling from. As well, when we look at discussions of this online, I don't think I've ever actually seen a pagan make a YouTube video about this. There are quite a few videos on YouTube, and they're actually quite interesting. Go watch them after this. But I think I am the first pagan to do this in a practitioner sense, because very tragically, there are almost no people who actually practice this tradition. There's a subreddit with like 500 people, but so few people do. And that's really tragic because this is a beautiful tradition. And I think it's one that deserves more attention. As a pagan, I believe in what's known as the plural world. And that is the idea that we deserve to connect to the gods of our place, the gods of our land, and understand our history in that way. So let's talk about this. And first, I think we should talk about idols, because the term wathanist, which is the sort of modern word that the few Arab pagans use for themselves, that sort of means idol worshiper, essentially. And that is because idols were incredibly important to pre-Islamic era pagans. They were central. They were everywhere. One of the big sites in Islam today, the Kaaba, which is that black cube that they circle around in Saudi Arabia, was originally a pagan site. And there was also a second Kaaba that was a ways away that was also a pagan site. They were temples. And what would happen is the pagans would go in, and much like how people do the circulation now, they would circle around it. However, they would not wear all white, and they would not shave their heads and cut their hair first. They would do it actually topless, and they would dance around and sing praises to specifically three goddesses. And these three goddesses are the ones that come the most. That would be Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Al-Manat. These are three goddesses. Much like we see this triple goddess theme emerging all over the world. They represented different things, and these three goddesses were incredibly important. Interestingly, they are infamous because there is an incident in Islamic history known as the satanic versus incident, and it is one of the most controversial things in Islamic scholarship. So basically what happened is Muhammad, who was raised as an Arab pagan, was approaching these Arab pagans, and they were prostrating. Interestingly enough, this actually incident happens in the surah in the Quran that explains prostrating for the first time. They were prostrating, and the pre-Islamic era pagans would prostrate a little differently. They would put dirt on their forehead, and they would often prostrate before idols or before stones, because stone worship was incredibly important to the pre-Islamic era pagans. If you look at the Kaaba today, there's actually a black stone on the corner that people touch and kiss, and it's never really explained in Islam why they do that, but the pre-Arab pagans saw crystals and stones. This is incredibly important. So crystal girls watching this, you are vindicated for once with some history. But basically, he prostrates, and he prays to Al-Uzza, Al-Lat, Al-Manat, and ask for their intercession, and uses the term Ganarik, which is the Arabic word for female and for crane, and basically says your intercession is hoped for. Now, in modern Quran translations, this is often changed a bit. Interestingly, the first few centuries of Muslims actually believed this was true, and then when Islamic orthodoxy was established, this was written out and seen as like pure heresy. It's seen as a lie, because if this is true, it would mean that Muhammad could be tricked. Thus, that Muhammad is not perfect, and ostensibly that he was tricked by Shaitan, which is the Islamic Satan. So basically he did this, but that on its own gives a clue to how Arab pagans prayed, because the Arab pagans around him assumed he was one of them. He thought he was one of the tribe, and they welcomed him in after this. Now, this is controversial, particularly amongst modern spheres. Recently, there was an author named Salman Rushdie, who is a magical realist novelist who wrote a book called The Satanic Verses that touched on the incident, and he was very tragically stabbed in one eye recently, which is awful, while he was giving a talk about free speech and free literature and all this stuff. And he got stabbed because the Ayatollah of Iran, the leader of Iran, issued a fatwa, which is a declaration of death. So basically, this guy wrote a book named after this incident and got told he should be executed for it. And people went out of their country to do it, which is insane, making this one of the most infamous things in Islam. But as pagans, you know, even though it's become so polarizing, that gives us a key as to what the pagans did. As well, it is recorded that the pre-Islamic Arab pagans believed in magic, they believed in astrology, and they believed in divination. Particularly, they had a form of divination where they would use arrows, like the weapon arrows, and they would throw them. And depending on which arrow landed further, they would write in Arabic names of things, and then they would throw it. And depending on where it would land, they would get their future from that. As well, they operated, it's assumed to be, that they operated on a lunar calendar. As well, their gods represented kind of pagan epithets, like they had moon gods, they had war gods, they had time gods, they had all the kind of gods you would expect in any pagan paradigm. To add to the worldview of the pre-Islamic Arab pagans, they actually believed in more spirits than just the gods and goddesses. In fact, they believed in a class of spirits known as jinn, and this actually carried into Islam. So basically what jinn are, they are genies. You don't trap them in lamps and rub them and they come out like in Aladdin, though the idea of them being trapped in lamps actually goes back to an account of Solomon, who allegedly had lamps and rings that he would trap jinn in, much like how you would trap a demon in Western demon magic, right? There's a parallel there. But beyond that, demon and jinn are pretty different. They get like put in the same category a lot, but they are different, because what's interesting about jinn is it's believed that there are multiple classes of jinn, and there are good jinn and there are bad jinn. If you look at the Islamic interpretation, you'll see that there are jinn that are known as Muslims and jinn that are kafir or unbelievers. But we can, extricate that into the Arab pagan worldview by saying there were good jinn and there were bad jinn. As well, it is believed, much like the idea of a daemon or a holy guardian angel, that everyone had a personal jinn. And so through specific ritualistic practices, you can connect to your personal jinn, and they were your sort of guiding spirit. Though they explain it a little differently, because jinn, unlike, angels or demons, have a lifespan, right? They live, they die, they eat, and it's believed that they can even have sex with humans and have babies with humans, which is like crazy and interesting, because an interesting parallel to that would be if you look at the Celtic world, the idea of fae. It's believed that the fae could have children with humans, and very tragically, the fae human sex lore turned into this idea that like kids who are born with disabilities were like half fae, and that gets really fucked up really quickly. But basically, jinn can have kids with you. They can even take the form of lizards, humans, and all sorts of things. But in their normal form, they are smokeless fire. And so if you look at descriptions of people who have done jinn sorcery, the term would be sorcery, they believe that the jinn can kind of talk to you. And so they had this belief of this personal jinn that you can contact and work with, which is really interesting from a mystic standpoint. Another thing to note when it comes to pre-Islamic Arab paganism is that this tradition was incredibly tribalistic. So a lot of pagan traditions were tribal, which means that different tribes worship different deities, right? If you look around Europe, you notice that different locations, they have different local deities, and even amongst the same sort of umbrella term of paganism, different groups of people would worship different things, right? If we look specifically at Greece, you'll notice that gods would move across Greece and they would travel, right? And in the Arab world, there was something similar. These gods were very tribal, and each tribe kind of had their own gods that they revered. And so if you look around the Middle East, all these regions had different paradigms. We know the most about the area where Muhammad grew up, because obviously, Islamic scholars had a vested interest in that. Also, a thing to note is to practice this is incredibly reconstructionistic, right? Even to make this video, I had to do a little bit of guesswork and a little bit of reconstructionism, because there are so few sources. As I said, the only source is the Book of the Idols, and that means that it's biased, but also that you have to be willing to reconstruct in specific ways, right? If you wanted to make this your religion, you would have to really put a personal devotion into these spirits and learn from the spirits, right? Your unverified personal gnosis would be really incredibly important because you'd have to put pieces together. The things that we know about their rituals is that there was a lot of dancing, that it was lively, that there was, a lot of chanting. But beyond that, I mean, there's a lot of questions. We know that they would prostrate. It can be assumed that certain ideas like praying 5 times a day probably came from paganism because it doesn't really originate in other Abrahamic religions. So I think one of the keys, if you wanted to follow this, would be to look at Islam and look at all the pieces that seem kind of out of place in compared to the other Abrahamic faiths, because Islam is pretty different from the other ones, right? There's some pretty extreme gaps. So I think those would be keys to unlocking it, right? As well, I think that if you wanted to engage with this, you would really want to look into that djinn lore, because that djinn lore seems very clearly pagan and it seems very clearly rooted in the pagan Arab world, right? A lot of that kind of seems original, though there are certain things that I would say probably do come from mainstream Abrahamic views. As well, I think that if you wanted to engage with this, you would want to make the idols. Very tragically, so few of the idols are saved. There's only a couple images. The images in this thumbnail are pretty much the only ones out there. So I would really advise you to make the idols and reconstruct them. And looking at keys of other Arabian mystic texts like the Picatrix. If you're an occultist, you're familiar with the Picatrix. The Picatrix is one of the foundations of astrology, and it comes from that part of the world. And if you look at the Picatrix, there are a variety of perspectives that are different from, Hellenistic or Vedic astrological perspectives. So looking into stuff like that would be really important to pulling out this tradition and seeing where it comes from and developing it into something more. As well, there were gods in this world. There were not just goddesses. Hubal would be the biggest god that gets mentioned. There is a debate that Allah was originally a pagan god, that he was a moon god. I'm not going to give my opinion on that one. I think that that's a very complicated debate because where it originates from is that in the pre-Islamic Arab mythology that we have, Allah was the father of the 3 goddesses of Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Al-Manat. So he would be a pagan god. But that raises another question. Is the Allah of Islam the Allah of Arab paganism? Because we sometimes see that, right? Where we take a pagan entity and then we syncretize it into Abrahamicism and it changes. A great example of this, and we're sticking with the Middle East thing, would be Melik Tau. Melik Tau is the peacock angel of Yazidism. Yazidism is an ethno-religion out of the Middle East, and they really revere this entity Melik Tau. And then if you look at Abrahamic traditions, you look at Gabriel. And interestingly, one Arab manuscript translates Gabriel as Jabriel with a J, which is cool. But that means that he did exist in the Arab consciousness, right? And so in certain Orthodox icons, you can see peacock feathers on Gabriel. But are Melik Tau and are Gabriel the same entity? I think that's a big question. And so saying the pagan Allah and the Islamic Allah are the same entity, I think is a really complicated one. It's similar to how the modern Lilith is sort of different from the traditional Lilith you saw in Kabbalistic manuscripts from way back, right? But I most believe they were his daughter. And I think if that's true and that the Islamic deity became the original Allah, that would be kind of paralleling the Saturn and Olympian myth from Roman and Greek mythology. I feel like there's kind of a parallel there in a strange way, if that is true. But granted, I'm not going to say they are the same entity because, that's a controversial opinion and one that I'm not even sure of myself, right? I haven't done enough exploration. I don't know enough to fully make that as a complete equivalency, right? That'd be a huge, huge theological discussion. As well, I think my advice would be to anyone engaging with this is to experiment, to try things out, and to figure it out on your own. I think that this is an explorative path. And this is one of the most extreme examples of Reconstructionism. And Reconstructionism of this extent has been done before, right? It's not an impossible task. If you look at the Druids of the Celtic world, we have almost as little records of Druidry as we have of this, right? It could be just as easy for people who in the past, did create a Druidic tradition. I have a video of Druidry on my channel where I talk about that tradition and how that emerged, to do something like that with this. It can grow, it can evolve, and we can sort of reach a place where everyone around the world has the form of paganism for them and is able to explore what their tradition. There is no sponsor for this video. I didn't want to put a sponsor on this video. I thought that sponsor might get a little pushback if I did that. So this is sponsored by me. Support my Patreon and keep me doing this. So if you join my Patreon, you get extra videos every month, you get all these early, you get ritual guides, which are like 20 pages now of rituals I've written. And of course, you can donate directly on Ko-Fi or on Venmo. Those are all below. You can follow me on all sorts of social media platforms. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, I'm on TikTok, I'm on Substack. I'm on Telegram. I'm pretty much everywhere. There's nowhere I'm not. I stream on Twitch under Darling at 9 p.m. EST on Tuesday. I do have the podcast, The Postmodern Iconoclast. It's on this YouTube channel, so you can just click on my channel. I have guests on every other week, and we talk about religion, philosophy, and all sorts of things. And we get sometimes a little spicy on there. So you should check it out and continue watching videos on my channel. Like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell. And if you ring the bell and you're subscribed for 93 days, you know what? I normally say you get your Holy Guardian Angels. You know what? I'm going to say you get your personal djinn this video. They will show up. You'll hear it in the back of your ear and the smokeless fire will rise. It'll be cool. So have a nice day, night, evening, wherever it is, wherever you are. All right, bye.